Well, hello, my name is Fred Whitford. I'm with the Cooperative Extension Service at Purdue, and I am very pleased to be able to offer this program as part of the North Manchester Historical Society series. Let me thank you very much for letting me come to your home and to be able to show you some old pictures of things of the past. And my hope is that by looking back, it'll bring back some good memories, and hopefully there'll be some pictures here that you will remember some of the families that are mentioned. So sit back, enjoy, and we'll go through the presentation of a look back in time. Well, to begin with here, you back in the early days, life was pretty rugged time on Indiana farms. And you know you're in Indiana when the pig makes the family portrait. And you can see these young girls. Many of you would have worn these types of clothes. These were they were handed down from one girl to the next or boy to the next. And also they were made of feed sacks, flour sacks, and those kind of things. Again, a very rugged existence, but families were very, very close, even when they didn't have much money to deal with. Uh, Rats were an issue on the farms, and so we would have rat campaigns all through this time period where, and you can see here, they got 70 rats. They kind of put them up on the wall, and they seemed like they had basically done something really special here. And for every rat, this was important because every rat cost a farmer about $2. When you were only making 20, 30, or 40 cents an hour during this time period, obviously each rat was worth a lot of hours of work. One of the things that was interesting was during this time period that after World War One, there was a lot of dynamite left over. So the government said, well, what do we do? And they basically said, let's give it to farmers. And so through the extension office, we would put on live demonstrations where we would actually blow up things, rocks, boulders, stumps. And in this case, what we're doing is we are cleaning out a ditch. Uh, it was an era where farms were inundated with water, that in much of the northern part of the state where everything was waterlogged, we began to put in tiles, and it's the old clay tiles that were put in. And this really was a major advancement in that we were able to drain some of the fields so that we could actually produce crops. Now, we had an erosion problem. We've always had an erosion problem because anytime there's ground and rain, the ground wants to erode. So in the earlier days, the way that was controlled, what you're looking here is at a fence, and this fence that goes across this ditch, it's called a brush dam, a brush fence. And the idea was to slow the water down. And so when the water slowed down, it would drop its soil and capture that soil where we could fill it up. This was one of the better examples that I got where you can see here the erosion that's behind it in front of it. And if you look at it right here, you can see they placed some bags in front of it and they planted some grass. Now notice the ditch behind it. That's the important piece. After a single rain, this particular bags and grass was able to capture all of this soil that was moving downhill, and you can see here that ditch no longer exists. Now, obviously, that meant that this also eroded from somebody else's field. For those of you that are listening that are from agriculture, you remember why we have pH and why we always are very interested in pH. So pH is important. It's how sweet or sour the soil is. And certain crops can't grow at lower pHs that we have in Indiana. This was critical, especially for alfalfa and some of the other crops that we needed to put lime on it. So in this case, you can always tell the extension agent at the time. He always wore a suit and tie and hat. And here he's with this farmer and he's showing the farmer and taking a lime taking a pH test. And he's going to tell this farmer, is your pH out of range? What can we do, such as liming, and how much lime we would need? So that particular farmer then would have to order lime. Now, this is just amazing because at the time, the lime came in on these trains. And if you didn't want to pay an extra fee for leaving it on the tracks, then everybody that ordered it would get the men, their boys, and we would unload the lime and we would put them in these wagons. Now, looks pretty cool, pretty neat, a lot of labor. But if you think about it, a field may need 2, 3, or 4 tons of lime to adjust the pH to be able to grow some things that could normally not grow well. So let's just, for the sake of argument, say that each one of these, the larger ones, would hold 2 tons. That would mean that for every acre, I would need one of those wagons. Doesn't seem like it's that much, but when you consider we had no roads, and the further out the farm was, this would be very, very difficult to be able to lime the soils. So what would happen is some entrepreneurs then decided that they would, since we have limestone croppings here, that what they would do is to go on farms and they would actually crush the limestone for the farmer for a fee. And there was a lot of this sort of interest early on to try to help farmers that could not have access to the railroads and that lime to be able to have lime. We pretty much applied it back then in this manner here. You would have a man driving the horses. You would have one shoveling it back into the spreader on the very back. And as you can see here, making the application. Then we got sort of fancy and we had the spinners. And you can see here, this as this thing is going down the row, that it's spinning out just like a spreader on your yard, or if you've seen the spreaders of today, fertilizer spreaders, you'll see it's pretty much done the same thing. Being able to tell farmers that they needed lime was critical because in this case, we needed to be able to grow plants that we could feed livestock. Livestock were a major component. So anytime that we would be able to grow alfalfa, lespedeza, and other types of crops that we could feed livestock at higher levels and better quality, then this was something that farmers absolutely wanted. The problem was we couldn't get lime everywhere. And this is an older picture showing, and I'll let you take a guess at what you think it is. This is soybeans. So early on, soybeans were grown as a hay crop. It was an annual that we could plant, and it could grow in pHs that were lower than the alfalfa. And so it was well adapted for Indiana soils, and farmers then used it to feed cattle. It was very successful. And so again, at first, that's what it was grown for, not like we use it today. We always say that farmers are some of the best inventors there is. And so in this case here, look at the tire on the car and just notice what it is what they're doing. They've got the car jacked up, and what they're running is a belt to run the machine that is actually going to separate the soybeans, pull the beans out of the pods. So again, if without a lot of equipment and tools, you had to devise those kinds of things. In the early days, corn was planted. It was called open pollinated corn, which meant one farmer saved his seed from one year to the next. And this is on the farm of Mr. Kelly in Wabash, and it shows what you would do. You would shock them, and then you would actually then have to at some point be able to take the corn off the shock. This is 1923, and again, Mr. Kelly in Wabash County. A closer up look from him. In fact, I should mention to you that if you see any pictures in here that you would like, I would be glad to share any of these with you. because many times we'll find that there may be somebody in the audience that's a relative of Mr. Kelly's, great grandson, daughter, or they farm the farm that he had. So again, if you're interested, just let me know. One of the more interesting things that just amazed me, that at the time, people had open pollinated corn, not hybrid corn like we have today. And so the question was, is corn a living thing, as you're seeing here? And the answer is it has to be, because we plant seeds and the seeds have to germinate. But at the time, the corn was being stored outside, which meant that much of the middle to northern part of the state, the freezing weather would kill a lot of the seeds that were being stored outside on the cob. So what happened was Extension decided that they would take a look at it, and they already knew it through research, that we were planting about a third of the crop was already dead based on the freezing temperatures. So what we did was we asked farmers to bring in their seed ears, which you see here, and we would test every ear to look at the germination. And those that were poor germinators went to the hogs. Those that had good germination and no disease, that was what we planted. It was a huge advancement in being able to basically have more plants coming up that we could harvest. What you're seeing here is they're putting individual seeds. They're going to fold that over. Each one of those rows corresponds and it's numbered to an ear. And what they're going to do is, like we did in science, you're going to take your seeds, they're going to wet this and let it germinate. And then the extension person on your right is going to look at every seed to see if they germinate, and then to see if there's any disease. And then the man in the background is recording the information. And this is how they're going to separate the corn for hogs or the corns for seed. We began to get much better. This is on the Troyer farm. And so they began to take the ears of corn and they began to do a better job in setting them up where they could actually dry. So if you notice here in a barn, it's going to be dried with the air can flow through it. Here is another example being stored where air can move through it. And they would have a way of probably heating this to keep it from getting to those extremely low temperatures. Now, in the 1930s, hybrids, and especially into the 1940s, what happened was that hybrids, we would cross different lines and produce these hybrids that we still use today. It would take over on farms, and this would be the case where a farmer would have to buy the seed in order then to get these much higher yields. These particular hybrids would stand better. They were more consistent. I could reach the ears. So many benefits to it. And this happens to be one of the main Broderick brothers near Wabash that began the process of selling hybrid seed, which only a few farmers at the time were actually selling. And then this is looking at the Broderick farm near Wabash, and what they're doing now is shelling and inspecting corn, hybrid corn, that's going to be then moved on to the farms. They would grade the corn to make sure then that there was quality seed that was being sold. And you can see on the bag, on the right-hand side, it says certified seed. And this was extremely important because now farmers could have some sense based on this somebody inspecting the corn that was not part of the business, that they would be buying high quality corn because again they were paying for it. And then we would actually bag it up as we're doing here. And again, you can see Indiana certified. This is done through the Corn Growers Association at the time. So the animals were an extremely important part. And when I hear people talking about large pigs, I'm telling you, these are large pigs. You could almost ride these babies. Um, and this is what the hogs at the time looked like. Today, they're obviously much different. They're leaner, they're smaller, they're more muscular. But again, this is from this era. And one of the things that was important is that many of these hogs were actually put on pastures. And the problem is typically if you leave animals on the same pasture over and over, then you get builds up sometimes of problems such as worms. So you can see here the hogs being fed, being watered. And so now because of that, we had to deal with worms. It was a new concept. And so the veterinarian that's right there in the middle with the hog would ask people, bring in your runt hogs. And so some farmers would bring them in, and what he would do basically would be to dissect them, open them up, and show these farmers that these runt hogs were full of worms. And the worms ate all the food that this hog was taking in, and that's why he was a runt. So it was a really a big move then to then be able to get people to actually vaccinate and worm their hogs, as what we're doing here on the Ogden farm in 1947. Again, on the Ogden farm, taking care of external parasites and trying to keep the hogs healthy was extremely important. Now, what happened was it's a long drawn out process, but as most of you know, horses and mules were extremely important on farms for power. And so when World War One came about and all the men went off to war, there wasn't enough men to run these plows and these smaller units. And so this would also occur during World War II as well. So during the war, Extension showed farmers how to team up horses and how to team up mules so they could pull larger pieces of equipment. And the idea was that you could actually do the same amount of work if you teamed your horses up by pulling larger equipment. It was a way of not needing more men or women to do the work. In the same way that today that the Amish team up their horses, they understand how to team them up and how to pull things and how to make these horses work there on the farm. We would have basically field days where we would show people there's a system of tying them together. And you could see here, this is one of those particular examples where we're teaching people how to team up their horses. And I think it was 5, 7, and I think 9 and 11, but you could get larger numbers of horses. And you could see the thousands of people, you could see the cars in the background with the interest. Horses was very important, mules were very important. And so here you're looking at Wilbur Thomas of Wabash, who would get the best purebred Belgian colt. And the Belgians was a workhorse that again, Amish have even today. Beautiful animal, and he was, Mr. Thomas was best of show that year. What people have long forgotten is during the World War II was, again, 1918s, the following that was a depression. Was not the Great Depression, it was the Ag Depression of the 20s. In the 30s, it was the Great Depression, and toward the end of the 30s into the 40s were World War II. But at this particular time, this is the Ag Depression, that after World War I, the prices of everything that had skyrocketed during the war had really dropped, and farmers were having a difficult time even paying their taxes. So Extension went through and looked at, as you can see here, we taught people how to tell if a bird was laying. And this was extremely important because you didn't want to feed a bird if she wasn't laying eggs. The object was to get eggs to be able to sell. And in fact, during the Great Depression, raising chickens and selling eggs is what saved many a farm here in Indiana. So, as these folks would learn, they would look at the chicken, and where the egg came out, if it was 3 fingers wide, she was laying eggs, and if it was 1 fingered wide, she was not, and 2 was probably not either. Farmers, being farmers, decided, I don't believe it. This hen looks very, very good. She's surely laying eggs. So what extension showed was if I put those that were 1 and 2 fingered birds in a pen, and I took the ones that were 3 fingered, put them in the pens, the ones that were 3 fingers, fed and watered the same, would be laying eggs, and the ones and the others would not. So throughout the state of Indiana, we were culling out just massive amounts of birds that were being fed and not laying eggs. And so the idea was if we fed the birds, that feed that was being wasted now could go to those that were being productive. And it's, as you can see here, then this became a source of. This is Mrs. Witzel near Lake Town, where she is now grading and packing eggs. So the people buying eggs, specifically out of the New York City area, wanted consistent, clean eggs that looked the same, which is what you see in the stores today. And so here she is actually going through and grading them, and she's already got them clean, and then they're going to be shipped, which she could get more money for them being shipped. This is what your typical dairy looked like back then. There were thousands of dairies, and today we're down to, if I said dozens, I probably wouldn't be too far. Obviously, our largest is Fair Oaks, but this is what it looks like. You can see the cans for the milk, and they were where they were draining. And what's interesting to me was that we sold butterfat, we sold milk. Much of this was pasteurized initially, and you can see here then what he's doing is actually taking skim milk and feeding it to the pigs, because who would drink skim milk? And in today, obviously, things have changed, and we drink skim milk, except at my house where we drink whole milk, and my grandson loves whole chocolate milk as well. He won't drink the skim milk, which is great because he's following his grandpa's lead on that. Now, the same thing. Is it possible that a cow was eating more than she was returning in milk and in butter fat? And so what Extension did was we would get these farmers, and I think it was roughly 21 dairymen, and those dairies may have 5, 6, 20, 30 cows was about all. And this man would come around once a month. He would record how much feed was being fed to the animals. He would record butter, fat, and milk production, would calculate that over the month. And from that then, farmers could see that some cows were costing them, basically for housing them, they were not making any money at all. In fact, they were losing. So this was an extremely important process of bringing the dairy industry forward. And from that, then, we began to look at breeding and other things. But this was the start of looking at how much cow and how much milk and butter fats produced. We love to take tours. And so in Extension, we would go out to various farms to look at some of the leading farms, to look at how these people were doing their work. And from that, because we are an industry that we learn by seeing first, then reading, this gave people ideas about what they could do on their own farm. We would bring in into the schools. Can you imagine doing this today? Bring into the schools. We would bring these animals in, and we would have our lessons being taught. Notice how close these men are to the cattle. Again, think about today. First of all, we couldn't get in, and B, I guess we'd have to have them separated by a mile. But back then, up close, personal, live made a huge difference in how we taught. Now, we talked about Lyme earlier on, And so Purdue would send out trains. Trains became a way of reaching farmers who could not make it to Purdue. So here is an example where men would bring in and women would bring in their soil samples. The people would analyze it there. They would give them their readings and then the pH readings, and they would tell them how much lime they needed. And again, these trains went around the state. This happens to be a dairy train, and you can see they were announced ahead of time. People would show up at the station, and then they would hear lectures, in this case, using live animals. Maybe it was about breeding, maybe it was about feeding, maybe a balanced diet, whatever. What's interesting here again is if you look over on the right hand side, you can see boys are always boys, and they're on top of the one of the rail cars watching the program. This is what it looked like on the inside of. They would have cars that were set up where people could come and listen to, let's say, a Purdue speaker talk about corn borers on corn or hybrid corn or anything, raising hogs, whatever that train was, the subject of the train was. And this is what it looked like. Now, a lot to do with production, but the home was not forgotten either. So, Joe Betstold Farm in Urbana, there was a lot of effort of trying to improve the conditions of the home, and especially focusing on the woman and basically what they considered work that was just mundane. What could we do to help this woman to better her family through feeding, through cleaning, but also to give her some time for herself? Now, today a vacuum cleaner is not a big to do, but back in the early days, you're seeing 1934, this was huge. Mrs. Hartzell here has got a electric sweeper. And the reason this is important is electricity during the Great Depression was really part of the national program that Roosevelt had. And so you're seeing here the sweeper, which would make her job quicker, but she also had electrical power. In Indiana, many people did get electricity into the late 40s and early 50s. If you were lucky enough to have electricity, then you were able to have electric washing machines. You would have any sort of these devices that would allow you to get your work done quicker, which gave you more time to do other things. I always loved what it looks like on the inside of these old stores, and I guess I have a love of the old stores and been through many feed stores through my time. But you know what they sold, how they sold, and that's personal service that you got from these stores. So this is the Basher Feed Store in North Manchester. Hopefully somebody that's listening to this program would remember something about that particular store. Now, part of the effort in the home was we really didn't have, we had county ag agents, and off and on we would have home ec agents, home economic agents, but for many they did not. So the way that this worked and still works is that Purdue would send out specialists, and they would send them out to the counties, and in the counties were these home economic clubs, and of which literally there were tens of thousands of women across the state who belonged to these clubs. They're very active on many different fronts. And so each club in the county they would all agree to the topic of the year. And so what they would do is send a specialist out, and whether it was mending, closing, cooking, mending, repairs on carpets, I mean, the whole list goes on and on. And so what they would do is train these leaders, and then the leaders would go back to their clubs and repeat the process. So if you're familiar with the term train the trainer, this is what we're talking about. You can always tell an extension program. We just even if something is pretty simple, we want to label things, and so understanding that refrigerators were predated by ice boxes, were predated by how we stored things. And these are underground units that we built basically out of culverts. And you could put these in to be able to protect some of your things that could be stored this way, because obviously in the winter time the difficulty was you better have had a garden, you better have stored a bunch of the stuff that could be stored like potatoes, because in the wintertime what few roads there were scattered around, but most of these lanes and dirt roads were not passable. So it was important that we have enough food to make it through the winter, a good variety coming out of the gardens. Because farming is and was extremely dangerous occupation, then the women were often taught how to take care of sick people, and whether it was broken bones or whatever, and or TB and or fevers, they became in essence the nurses that took care of their kids, family, husbands, wives, whatever the case would be. Now, the extension got very involved with the schools. And here is a typical one-room schoolhouse. And actually, I put this in for a number of reasons, because the home ec ladies were very concerned that the kids were coming to school hungry, much the same way we do today, which is still unbelievable. But these kids were coming to school hungry off the farms. And so what the home ec ladies did was they began to institute some programs where they could actually heat water during the winter, as an example, where these kids could have hot chocolate, could have hot cocoa, could have soup, whatever they wanted to bring. And then that would eventually evolve into government programs that tried to feed kids. We were very active in the schools, because everybody that we spoke to were going to end up back on the farm more than likely. So you can see this extension person, you can see some of the kids up front with their ears of corn. He's teaching them about how to store corn, how to test corn, how to plant corn. And again, these kids, being kids, would believe everything that he said. And it was much easier to make changes amongst the children than it was their parents. And what was interesting then, and even today with my children and my grandson, is that these kids would go back home and repeat to their fathers and the mothers what they had learned, and we were able to often impact them at the time as well. We would take kids to the field to learn how to basically pick good corn before there was hybrid. We would teach them what we were looking for. Like, for instance, we didn't want an ear that was way up high because I couldn't reach it. It was hand picked. So they looked for corn that was where I could pick it. They looked at corn that had good stalk, no insect and diseases. Again, characteristics that they could select. They were basically doing genetic work without realizing it. During World War II, when the Japanese had taken over the islands, there was United States that no longer had a supply of material called kapuk, if I'm pronouncing that right, which were used to make life vests, used to make all kinds of things so that these sailors and men that flew planes, if they were ended up in water, could float. So we needed about 1 million more life vests. And so what happened was we needed new materials, because we didn't have access to what we used to get off the islands in the Far East. So long and short, it was found that the old common milkweed, a pest on today's farm, was found to be equivalent to the material that we had from the Southeast Asia. And so we couldn't grow it because it would take 3 years. We needed them right now. So what happened was, which was really neat, they looked around and said, during World War II, the men are fighting. Most of the women have already gone to the factories, or in fact, are in serving in the war themselves. And so the only labor we had was the kids. And so the kids were paid so much per bag. And I think it was every couple of bags of this, they would collect the milkweed pods. And if you ever remember, if you ever open up a pod, you would see that fiber in it. That's what they were collecting. So the kids would collect it, then they would dry it at home or at the school, and then it would be collected and sent to the plant in Michigan where it was turned into fibers, which was then shipped around to other manufacturing plants to make the life vest and all the other items. No telling how many men and women who served on ships and planes were saved because of what these young people did to be able to collect this wild milkweed plants across the counties. Just an amazing fact that I did not know. So as we end the program then, some of you would have been part of 4-H programs, and this is a girls 4-H club program. Um, and so these girls, these boys would all learn different things that would be important to them as they went back to the farms or in their lives. Here we're showing some young fellows here, what we about young pigs, and typically we would have a leader of the club, and in this case maybe it's the gentleman on the left with that's pointing to the hogs, or we would go to a farm where these kids would get hands-on instruction, and then they would repeat that with their own animals. Girls too would raise hogs, they would compete, but everything in 4-H was typically set up to be able to show other people what you had accomplished. So here we're getting a hog, we're getting them all cleaned up for the county fair. This young lady is competing with baking bread, and I had to learn. I've not seen this except through pictures, but you could see that got the 3 canisters that apparently is what would light the top of the stove, and then the box would be the oven that was placed over the heat. I hope I have that right, but it was the way that baking was done. The kids would have 1-acre contest of corn, and oftentimes they could double, triple, or quadruple what the county average was because they were following some of the information that Purdue was telling them. And these kids would compete. They would get their ribbons. I'll ask you who this guy looks like. And most of you would say it looks like alfalfa. But actually this is Stewart, Mr. Stewart of Stewart Seed. And so he would become a powerful force in the seed business with hybrid corn. And in fact, the company is still there today. But he's had his start with extension in these contests. So from that then, there's a whole series of books that we did called Memories of Life on the Earth. This was a J.C. Allen set of photographs. Love this little boy and his dog on the fence. Mr. Allen worked at Purdue, traveled around the country, primarily Indiana, taking pictures. We have pictures called Enriching the Hoosier Farm Family, which I call the picture book from the county agents up until about the 1930s. And the same thing here is called Scattering the Seeds of Knowledge, I call the word book. And it has a lot of the examples that we talked about today. And then earlier on your right, is called The Grand Old Man. You're going back to the late 1800s, early 1900s. Mr. Latter was the first, I call him the first ag professor. He was the second, but the first one didn't last long. Mr. Latter would become famous at Purdue for putting in extension programs to help people on their farms. Virginia Meredith, the Queen of American Agriculture, a major mover shaker. She owned her own livestock farm as well, and Mr. Latta would hire her to travel around the state to tell men how to raise cattle. She was good at it. And she would also become the first president, I think the first two-term presidents of the home economic clubs in the state. And then Mary Matthew, who she would adopt, would be the first, would become, I believe, the first dean of the home economics department. And then as you go to your left, for the good of the farmer, is John Skinner. Mr. Skinner was the first dean, but Mr. Skinner built Purdue. Just a remarkable story about his life. So I'll leave you with this picture here. You know, these pictures tell us a lot. For those of us that enjoy history, they tell us things that you can't read about, but when you see them, you understand. So I really hope that you enjoyed the program. I hope that you saw some pictures that brought back, that you remember things from your own past. If I'm lucky enough, you saw some things and some people, specifically people who you knew, or you knew, I should say, of their families, and somehow that hopefully some of these would have been related to you. So with that, again, thank you very much for allowing me to be in your home to share my PowerPoint with you.